we should be demanding solutions to the fear, the anger. People are genuinely scared what's happened as a result of Southport. And yet we're talking about, we're given license to politicians to talk about the far right and rioting and how awful it is. I kind of feel I understand it, but I feel frustrated by it.
And I think you raise a very important point, Nick, because there was a video when Keir Starmer laid a wreath in Southport. And if you go to the very end of the video, you've got some men shouting, and they're clearly not from the area. You can hear it in their accents. But then there's a woman who breaks down in grief and hurt and anger and just a deep sense of frustration that this has been allowed to happen, that it has happened. Obviously criminal procedures are active, so let's not speculate about who was responsible and so forth. But a deep sense within the community of Southport of hurt. And then what happens is that you have these rioters shipped in from outside of the area, causing huge levels of destruction and damage, criminal offences being committed, and then it's very easy to turn around and say, well, look who's responsible for this, and we're not getting to the nub of the issue.
Well, we're letting them off the hook.
And it's very easy, as you say, for the politicians to say this is sickening, and it is right to say that the rioting is sickening, but actually, what about the issue of knife crime? How is it possible that this has been allowed to happen? And there is no conversation about that, and there's no conversation.
I think it's disgraceful. I mean, one thing Cameron did in 2011 was, after the riots then, he recalled Parliament, and he had his whole front bench listen to MPs like me at the time, because I was in Enfield where we had the riots, and I was there during the riots, actually telling them what people had said to us in the streets about how they felt. And, I think we're almost, if these things escalate, which, God, I hope they don't, we may be in that situation again.
And the other issue is that, and this is on Labour as well as it is on the Conservatives, there's never been a plan about community cohesion. How do we bring people together? How do we deal with this? I get the argument that if you deal with stopping the boats, if you deal with people feeling better off, then somewhere down the line they're not going to feel better, and we're not going to have this huge level of dissatisfaction and unhappiness bubbling up in our communities. But actually, something much more short-term and immediate needs to happen to pull people together. And we saw that in the wake of what happened with the riots, in terms of, you saw those fantastic videos of firefighters and builders, everybody turning up at Southport, but still a dearth of political leadership from Starmer and his government in this particular regard, I think.
And he's Director of Public Prosecutions, of course, as he kept telling us. And his father's a toolmaker. Well, let's see what he can make out of this. But look, let's move on to some other things, because there are some. Keir Starmer's government, basically his Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, are dropping plans to raise the income barrier for migrant spouses. Now, it's currently, I think, 29,000 you have to earn to come into, basically, legally migrate into this country. The Tories were going to whack it up even more, and now she's gone, brakes on, I'm not going to do that, and we're going to take a look at it. This is interesting.
This is the legal route. We're not talking about small
illegal
boats.
migration.
We're not talking about small boats. We're talking about trying to attract people here to fill vacancies in the economy that we cannot fill. Now, the Tories, as you say, were going to put up the income threshold to 38,000 for spouses. What the hope was that actually, if you can fill the gaps with people who are out of work here and can be brought into the economy, whether they're on benefits or some kind of income support, and you can actually, or they don't have the skills or the training or whatever, but you can get them into those positions so you don't need to necessarily rely on workers from overseas to come in. What this will effectively do is, by increasing it, well, let's start with what the Tories wanted to do. By increasing the threshold, it would make it less attractive, much less attractive, for workers to come in from overseas to work in this country, because they won't be able to bring their spouses with them. What there seems to be an admission in this is, by actually keeping the threshold at 29,000, is actually, let's not proceed with that, because we still need these workers to fill vacancies within...
There's a flaw, though, you see.
Within our economy.
Because how much tax do we really earn from someone coming in on £29,000? The bottom line is, you will be bringing people in to do jobs. Some of them, if they're bringing their families in, we may find that there's housing benefits, that there's working tax credits involved and so forth. You could actually have net tax non-contributors. I think I got that wrong. You know what I mean. And that means, in a way, we're subsidising businesses to bring people in, aren't we?
So if you look at GDP it has actually gone up. But actually, if you look at GDP per capita per head in the country, it's actually not increased. It's slipped back. It's slipped back slightly, and that's, of course, as a result of more people in the economy. But there is a wider question, actually, of the government, Labour could potentially keep up that threshold at 38,000, but it needs to be able to support its plans to fill those vacancies within the economy that wouldn't otherwise be filled, because now, of course, if they maintained the threshold, they could, of course, they wouldn't, of course, be able to use overseas workers to fill those those gaps. And there isn't at the moment, and it will take some time if they are to be successful. Even it will take some time for those workers to filter through from domestic, from our domestic economy.
Let me kind of put this to you. Labour believe growth is the answer to all the problems. Actually, I think they've got a point. Okay, focus on growth. Obvious. You don't need to be a genius to work that out. However, that they're basically saying needs immigration. We need growth through immigration, effectively, because we cannot get growth. That's a tension, when on the other hand, they're kind of saying we've got to control immigration, legal immigration even.
They're saying it, absolutely. They're saying that in the short term, but Keir Starmer did, in fairness to him, give a speech the other day where he said what he wants to do is the Migration Advisory Committee, he wants it to work hand in hand with a new organisation called Skills England, which would be training people in schools and FE colleges to make sure they had the right skill sets that employers want to take them out. Now, of course, two questions. That takes two problems with that. It takes time, and the second problem is, can they actually be successful? Can those two organisations, one which will, of course, come under the Department for Education and the Department for Business, namely Skills England, and the Migration Advisory Committee, which would come under the auspices of the Home Office, can they work effectively together to actually ensure that those gaps in the economy are filled by people who are coming out of schools and colleges in this country, rather than employers simply saying, we haven't got time to wait for this, we haven't got time, we can't be bothered, let's just go over, let's just recruit from overseas.
Let's try and get cheaper labour in, same old problem, and many of them know that they can get subsidised by the government through working tax credits, etc. But on top of that, you've also got, basically, other employers starting to train their own people. They're literally opening schools to train their own people because the state is failing them, because they haven't got that connect between what business needs and actually what we're training them for.
And that's the old gripe from businesses, is that they're out there and they're saying we're not able to recruit the young people we need, or if they're out there, they don't have the right skills, they don't necessarily have the right attitudes, they don't necessarily have the right motivation to turn up on time and do the jobs that can often be quite difficult jobs to do. And it's about bridging that gap so actually businesses are able to get those young people from our schools and FE colleges.
Let's turn for a minute, if we may, to the BBC. Now, I grew up with the BBC. I remember it being a great organisation doing stuff. I barely a week goes by when I'm questioning, why do we still have this organisation? We've got the horrors of a situation where we've now got two actions today. First of all, the Hugh Edwards story, which, let's recap very briefly what's happened here. The BBC have admitted now, on the same day, that he pled guilty to these, indecent, horrible charges of essentially making child pornographic images, right? They said they knew he was under arrest back in August. They carried on paying him to the tune of about £200,000. I think he even got a pay rise because he was still on full pay. That just is mind-blowing. Some might say, well, he was only arrested, he wasn't guilty, and we should have continued paying him. My view is he was suspended. That was the point you said, you're no longer suspended on full pay. I mean, how much more can the BBC do to dig themselves into a hole of shame?
And of course, BBC bosses knew about it.
Yeah,
and they knew about it. I don't know of any other employer that would behave in such a way. And remember, this isn't the BBC's money; it's our money. It comes from the licence fee payer, and I think British television viewers expect better. They expect a more the BBC to act with more integrity.
Why can't they learn? I mean, how many issues do we have to have for us to sit here and knock the BBC? I mean, they're not learning.
Well, it never ceases to change. And there is a meeting between, Tim Davie, the Director General, and Lisa Nandy, the Culture Secretary, to try and do something. But what I find interesting is actually Labour's already said the government's already said it's safeguarding the charter.
Yeah.
Whereas actually, what punishment do you need to introduce? Where should the government be going with this? Rather than just writing a blank cheque and saying yes, you can have more money, you can have your charter money, off you go, very good, well done, no mistakes, won't worry about those. Actually say enough's enough. We want to see some serious improvements in the way you're running the organisation, and then when we've seen those improvements, then we'll guarantee you the money.
And of course, running the organisation often comes down to both the structure and the chief executive. So they change. Let's say Tim Davie goes for some reason. I'm not saying he will, by the way, but say he goes. We get another person in.
But Tim Davie, by the way, is actually a conservative. I should point this out. So you put a conservative chief executive in charge of Director General. You'd like to think
no, because the last Conservative government demonstrated exactly how incompetent Conservative solutions should be. So don't draw a natural conclusion there. But that is probably the very best that would come, is that they'll change the chief executive. That institution, I mean, is inherently flawed because it gets its money anyway. It's simple as that.
What needs to happen is there just needs to be, and the BBC haven't provided this, but what's their policy? We know generally that, and this isn't a cast iron policy, but we know in Parliament, for instance, when an MP is charged with a crime, that is the point at which they resign. Now, obviously, there's a difference here because obviously Hugh Edwards was charged, and then there was a decision to act. But actually, there needs to be some transparency from the BBC about what their policy is. Now, if their policy is that if you're arrested, you're entitled to full pay and you're entitled to a pay rise even,
then we know.
Then we know. That's OK. That's your policy. That's your organisational policy. I'd be interested to see whether that is mirrored right across the public sector. And whether that, is that the policy within the NHS? Is that the policy within Whitehall departments?
Well, we know, for example, an MP can be arrested and paid still.
Yes, and we know that's the case. We know what the situation is in the Houses of Parliament, and of course, you could argue very easily that that's a very favourable situation to MPs. But at least we know, and there is that transparency. And I would guess that maybe the BBC has felt that they can behave in the same way that how political parties behave with their own MPs.
Let me ask you about this, though. It's BBC again. The BBC have been slammed by both Labour and Tory MPs because essentially they have described Ismail Haniyeh, who was, of course, killed in Tehran by the Israelis. They were describing him as a moderate terrorist. Is there such a thing as a moderate terrorist?
No. In one word answer. But I think so. It's extraordinary. Hamas, they killed 1,200 Israelis in that terrorist attack on October the 7th. They kidnapped another 250. This was an appalling act of terrorism. And this individual was the leader of Hamas's political wing and lived a life of luxury in Qatar. And then was, of course, visiting Tehran when Israel launched that assassination, which was successful. There is no justification for describing this individual as a moderate or a pragmatist.
For the love of God, Theo, it's such common sense. What is going on in the minds of people?
Hamas is a prescribed terrorist organisation.
It's extraordinary.
And you can't do that. And just the other thing, I think this is a really important point, and I've thought about this a lot, and I know from my previous roles that I've worked as a journalist, there's this really insidious idea that Israel goes out of its way to harm civilians, whether it be men, women or children. What is true is that Hamas uses women and children as human shields to guard their operatives, to guard their resources, whether it be in hospitals or elsewhere. And when Israel had the chance to take somebody out without any civilian casualties, it acted with precision and speed to do so. Israel and the IDF, it tries to minimise at every opportunity any civilian casualties. Of course it's a war, it does happen. But is there any reporting of the fact that actually there were no civilian casualties in this particular case?
Listen, I've got to interrupt you because there's some extremely important breaking news. Just get your immediate reaction to this. Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich is set to be released under a major prisoner exchange deal between Russia and the West. And obviously Stay with Talk throughout the afternoon as this story develops. Your reaction?
I think it's fantastic news, and not before time.
Didn't see this coming.
Well, there was an indication that
you did, I didn't.
Okay, I'll tell you why. Because the Russians brought forward his sentencing, and of course it was a ridiculous sentence. There was no foundation in the allegations that the FSB were bringing at all. But often what happens is that if they bring forward the sentencing and that actually somebody is sentenced, then the negotiations can start, because the FSB and the negotiators can say, well, he's guilty of a 16-year sentence, and then the horse trading can really start. But it's not before time. It's fantastic news for his family, colleagues.
I'll just repeat that. Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich is set to be released under a major prisoner exchange deal between Russia and the West. And as I say, stay tuned with us throughout the afternoon as this story develops. Theo Usherwood, fantastic. Thank you for joining us.